Hello everybody. Today I'm going to be looking at some of the 20th century's most influential thinkers on photography, Walter Benjamin, Roland Barthes and Susan Sontag. And I'm also going to be then looking at one of the most influential photographers of the late 20th century, Jeff Wall, and how his work responds to the ideas that were generated by Benjamin and Sontag and Barthes. And one of the primary considerations of that Sontag and Barthes brought to photography was the idea of the index and the trace, and how photography is forever linked to the real, there seems and appears to be a link between what was photographed and the photograph created. That this was particularly important to analog photography because of the recording of light, and the snapshot and the piece of time that has been taken and recorded, and as Bart discussed, the visual skin that we all share has been turned into an image. So mostly under consideration today will be Walter Benjamin's A Short History of Photography. It's also been translated as A Small History of Photography. He wrote it a number of times. It came through, I think there's 3 different versions, and we're also reading translations of those versions. So talk about the art of reproduction. He's continually teasing out this idea and refining this idea. We'll also be looking at Roland Barthes and some aspects of camera lucida. Barthes was fascinated by photography throughout his career. This was the last book that he wrote just prior to his death. It's a seminal book in late 20th century understanding of photography, particularly within art. So first we'll have a look at some parts, just some small parts of the Walter Benjamin short treatise, A Short History of Photography. This is really in many ways prior to, this was written prior to his probably more famous essay, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And it doesn't go into the way that essay does the idea of aura, but it's sitting in there waiting to be teased out. He looks back at the history of photography, and he's closer to it. This was written in the 1930s, so they're not that far away from when photography was originally invented, and he sees that there's not as a muddied history to photography because it's more recent than other forms of reproduction, such as printing, which he thinks of as having a fog around it and a type of imperceptible idea to its beginnings. This, of course, will change, and other people will bring new ideas to the beginnings of photography, Jeffrey Batchen, for instance. But Benjamin sees it as the clear of where photography has come from. Not where it's going to, but where it's come from. So this is fantastic. When inventors of a new instrument apply it to the observation of nature, sorry, I'm just repeating this quote, the hopes they place upon it are always insignificant compared with the subsequent number of discoveries of which the instrument was its origin. So who could have thought that photography would become so ubiquitous, such a dominant technology? Not the people who were inventing photography. They couldn't see it, everybody holding a camera. That wasn't I'm sure it wasn't where they thought photography was going to end up, that everybody could have a camera in their hand and photographs could be shared instantly between everybody. That film and TV news, Instagram, social media, nearly all of media itself has been driven by the photograph. And we have no conception of where these inventions will end up. That subsequent number of discoveries, of which the instrument was the origin, the photography just grew through society. It ran through society like water through from the roots to the leaves of a tree. But to get there, he looks at some of the original and early photographers, and one of the photographs he discusses is by David Octavius Hill. This photograph comes from a series of photographs made by Hill, and they were studies for a fresco of a church. And so they weren't particularly made as photographs to be art. They were photographs that were made to make art later. And this where he's discussing in that fishwife from New Haven who casts her eyes down with such casual seductive shame. There remains something that does not merely testify to the art of Hill the photographer, but something that cannot be silenced, that impudently demands the name of the person who lived at the time and who, remaining real even now, will never yield herself up entirely into art. Well, the person in that photograph is actually Hill's wife, dressed as a fishwife. And Benjamin didn't know this. And does that change the picture that we are looking at? Does that material fact shift the photograph in any way? I mean, it stops being a journalistic evidence of a fishwife, but it doesn't in any way stop the art of Hill the photographer. Does it actually increase his art? Does it increase the importance of art in the photograph, in that everything within this photograph is a fiction? So once you realise that she's a model, the placement of the baskets, the way the skirt is and the folds of the skirt and the lines in the skirt and their relationship to those of the basket become more artistic because they become considered. That time has been spent to both visually create this image as much as to make the photograph. So these things shift and change. The knowledge of these images shifts and changes our readings of the images. For Walter Benjamin, the photographic image, though, isn't analogical. It doesn't originate in the world. It is a reproduction generated by a machine. The medium is a tool for generation. It generates evidence and expands knowledge, affects political change, but also disseminates those images out through a broader spectrum. So if we take this in, a photograph becomes evidence. It becomes ways of seeing that we didn't necessarily or weren't necessarily able to see beforehand, or to construct in a way that photography allows us to construct. So it's impossible to say anything about the fraction of a second when a person starts to walk. Photography allows us to. How does photography allow us to? How does it make us aware and of what he calls the optical unconscious? And his optical unconscious is nothing like Freud's conception of the unconscious. As Rosalind Krauss points out, the optical field has no unconscious. But what he's saying is that photography expands our vision. It's a prosthetic to vision, and that suddenly time gets to be made up of moments because of photography, and isn't in the same way in this fluid form that it had been before photography. It gets now to be made up of these individual considerations. And if we look at where these type of ideas come from. If you think of like Myra Bridges' Animal Locomotion, and you see, even in this crazy, seemingly drunken, silly walk version of the concept of walking, you can see where photography does interrupt the flow of the world, so that we see it in this fragmented version of events. So, like Octavius Hill posed his model, but when we look into those pictures, we look for that tiny spark of chance. But why do we get to do that? And how do we get to see these sparks of chances of this here and now? There's this link to reality. There's this, oh, okay, this was real. It was in front of the camera. But there's something that we can't do with our normal sight that we do with a photograph. He talks about the imperceptible point, the immediacy of that long past moment. The future so persuasively inserts itself that looking back we may rediscover it. How do we get to rediscover that future? How do we get to see these things? How do we get to see this evidence in a photograph? It's because of the sense of time and place that was impossible prior to photography. Pictures are directed against exotic, ostentatious, romantic sound of cities. He's talking about the work in this quote. He's talking about the work of Eugene Atget. They suck aura out of reality like water from a sinking ship. But what is aura? A peculiar web of space and time, the unique manifestation of a distance, however near that may be. So the aura is being in that place and experiencing, like, going to Paris or somewhere for the first time, a beautiful waterfall. It's the aura of the place. It's the magnificence of it. And photography does seem to suck it out of that place, of that event. In an attempt to reproduce it later, those tourist photographs that you've taken, you can look at the photograph, but really you had to be there. Aura is why you had to be there. The photography can't reproduce, but it can type of replicate in a way. That in reproducing you lose the sense of aura, is one of the things that Benjamin really talks about. But what I want to do now is concentrate on an image, from Atget. And I want you to look into this photograph, and I want you to think of everything you can see. And the things, if you were standing in front of these two women, you would not have the opportunity to study this environment in the same way that you do when you stand in front of a photograph. And that's obvious, oh yeah, sure, okay. You look at a photograph and you can see evidence, you can see all these things. But it's also that you don't see all these things when you're making, even the best photographer can't see everything in an image. That there is chance that occurs. So you can count the bricks in the corner, you can count the cobblestones. You can look up into that window and you can see the flowers that are sitting in the window. You can look to the woman in the white blouse and you can see the length of her heel. Or on the smock of the other woman, how worn and used the pockets are. Or how she seems to have to stuff her feet into the boots that she's wearing. But if you look back up to that window, there's a pair of shoes sitting in the window. You didn't see those before. And if you look over to the hotel sign and you look below that hotel sign, there's a double image of a child who's moved whilst, I think it's a child. Well, then again, those shoes are a bit like a woman's shoes. So there's all these things that you get to see in the image. There's solid, dependable, the stone cladding around the base of the building, the numbers that sit over the shop, or the door that tells us where it is, the Rue Fleuret, the hotel sign, all these solid bits of information. But there's all these other little pieces that we wouldn't take in without the aid of the photograph. We don't have photographic memories. photographic memories did not exist before photography, the idea of a photographic memory. We aren't able to take in all of a scene instantly in the same way a photograph collects all of a scene. It doesn't have a brain to think about it. It just collects all of that scene and then we make another image out of it. So photography is different. When he talks about optical unconscious, he's talking about us. He's not talking about the optical unconscious of photography. He's making this type of play for the things that we don't recognize. And goes on to quote Brecht, complicated by the fact that less than at any time does a simple reproduction of a reality tell us anything about reality. So we don't, when we look at these things, when we see them, if we were in that reality, we would see them completely different to the photographic version of them. So there's this play between what is real, what is perceived, later perception via the mechanical reproduction. That does that simple reproduction tell us anything about the reality itself? These questions are being brought up and investigated by Benjamin, and these get revisited throughout the photographic history, right through to the present day. And thinking of present day, he's extremely prescient. Through photography, close to them, people have as passionate an inclination to bring things close to themselves or even more to the masses as to overcome uniqueness in every situation by reproducing it. So within photography, through photography, even the unique is made to yield up its uniqueness because of reproduction, because of visibility, because of sharing. Those things stop being unique. And in the later essay, the work of the art in the age of mechanical reproduction, these thoughts get refined. The sense of the aura is lost on film, and the reproducible image itself demonstrates an historical shift that we have to take account of, even if we don't necessarily notice it. What does it mean when aura is lost? How does it function and how does it come about? Benjamin writes of the loss of aura as a loss of a singular authority within the work of art itself. But what comes through in this new space left by the death to the aura? How does the mechanically reproduced work of art manage to make up for this void? And that's something I'm going to look at in the second part of this talk. Hopefully you'll get there through the YouTube links.